In this video, we will implement a controller for the recipe section. And this is actually a pretty cool lecture where you will get some new knowledge, and so you will learn how to read data from the page URL by responding to the hash change event, and also how to add the same event listener to multiple events. So probably quite a long video, so let's get started. So in order to figure out how to implement a controller, let's think again about how we implemented the search functionality. So what we have here is that whenever we click on one of these recipes, we get the ID of that recipe right here in the URL bar, right? So take a look at this here whenever I click on these different recipes. So you see that the ID there changes. Now inside this URL, this entire part here is called the hash, okay? So it's the hash symbol and then whatever comes after that. So this here is the hash. And we can then actually make use of the fact that we change these hashes here whenever we click on one of these different recipes by using the hash change event in JavaScript. Okay, so there's an event that's called hash change that is fired off each time that the hash that we have in the URL changes to something else. Okay, and so let's go ahead and use that event. Okay, so this was just for testing here, and so let's now add an event listener. And this one we will actually add to the global object in JavaScript, so in the browser, which is window. So window.addEventListener and then the hash change. Okay, and what we want to call here is the control recipe function, which we didn't write yet, but that's what we're going to do next. Okay, so we had the control search function here. And so let's now create control search. So first thing that we should do in here is to actually get that hash, okay? So I'm calling this one the ID, and we can get it from window.location. Okay, so window.location is the entire URL, and if we then use the .hash property on it, well, that's then just the hash. So let's try that one out. Console.log the ID. So remember that we have this event listener here whenever we change the hash, which will then call the control recipe, which will log the current hash to the console. Okay, and of course we need some examples here again. So here we go. So take a look at this, where the ID of the search item that I click here, which is this one, will be translated here into the console, right? So you see that? Now if I click twice on the same, then nothing appears because we didn't change the hash, okay? And so the event is not fired. But each time I click on a new one, then the ID is here, of course, in the URL in this hash, and then also down here. So great, that part's already working. Now what we're really interested in is only this part, so only the ID, but without the hash. So let's take care of that. And we can simply do a simple replace, because this is a string, and so we can of course call all the string methods on it, and we will then replace the hash with nothing. Okay, and with that, the hash symbol will be gone. Okay, so let's now go ahead and do something with this ID. And first off, we need to change if we actually have an ID. Okay, because imagine that we would simply do this, so get rid of everything, then we don't have any ID, and so we don't want to create a recipe object. So we only do all this logic that we're writing next in case that we actually have an ID. So let's add some comments here, just like we've done before. So get the ID from the URL. Then prepare the UI for changes. So this is similar to what we had before again. Create a new recipe object, of course. Then get the recipe data. Then we need to call our functions that they created for the servings at the time. So calc time and calc servings. So we need to call them here as well. And finally, when we have all of this in place, we can then render the recipe. Okay, so let's fill this here up. with whatever we already have. So prepare UI for changes. We don't have any UI methods just yet, but what we can do here is to create the new recipe object. Okay, and of course, again, we will put this in our state. So we already have the search inside our state, and next we will put then the recipe. So state.recipe will be a new object based on the recipe. And of course, what we pass in here is then our ID. Okay, next up, let's get the data from the server. And so we need to call getRecipe, right? So that's one is at state.recipe.getRecipe. Now, of course, we want this to happen asynchronously. So in the background and in a way that the rest of the code is only executed after we get back with the data. So we are going to use, of course, await here, and don't forget to then change the function to an async function. So yet another async await function here so that we can load our recipe data in the background. Next up, state.recipe.calcServings. All that starts with calcTime. Okay, and finally, we can then render the recipe to the UI. We cannot do that just yet, but let's simply log the object, okay? So state.recipe, because for now we don't have any UI methods just yet. Okay, so let's quickly go over that again. So we start by getting the ID from the URL by using window.location.hash and then replace the hash symbol with nothing, so that instead of the hash, we just end up with the actual ID that we need for the search. Then we create a new recipe object based on a model that we coded up in the last lecture, save it in our state, just like we did with the search. So again, all of our data is stored in one central place, which is the state that we can then get access to. Then after that, we call getRecipe here, which due to the fact that it's an async function, will return a promise. And so therefore in here we use await to wait for the promise to get back with the resolved value. Okay, so here the code will stop executing, and then after that we will simply calculate the time, the servings, and log everything to the console. So let's test that one out. Searching for pizza again, and let's try this one, pizza dip. So we get the ID, of course, and then our recipe. And all the data is actually here. So that's amazing, right? So we can right now select recipes from our search list, and it will already display the data here in the console. So here's the next one. And if we click on another one, then of course it will work as well. And so great, that part is already working. Now imagine that we would reload this page here. Okay, then nothing happens, because again, this only happens whenever the hash actually changes. Okay, and so we need to fix that, because imagine that the user saves this URL here as a bookmark, for example, and then when he comes back, then nothing happens really. Okay, and so what we need to do also is to add an event listener to the load event, which basically fires whenever the page is loaded. So window.add event listener, load, and then control recipe. Now I promised you in the beginning of the video that I would show you how to basically add the same event listener to different events. And that's useful here because we're calling the same function here simply for these two events. Okay, so let me show that to you. And it's actually very simple. We just need to think a little bit about it. Okay, so let's comment out these two. And what I'm going to do is to do an array with these two events. So hash change and load. And then I will simply add a loop to it. So a for each, where each of the elements is an event. And I will then do window.addEventListener. And then in here we pass the event. So event, and then of course control recipe. And that's it. So we just went from 2 lines here to just 1 line of code. Now if we had like 10 lines with these events, then of course it would become even more useful. Okay, so let's get rid of this here, and I hope this made sense to you. So again, we saved the strings for these two event types into an array and then looped over them and called window.eventListener for each of them, passing in the corresponding event. Okay, and so let's check it out now. Let's reload it. And you see that now it's happening. Okay, so the load event is now doing its work here, and it doesn't only work in case that the hash actually changes, but also if the page loads. Okay, and so now it's even more important that we have that if statement which checks if there's actually an ID, okay? Because right now there's not an ID, and so we, of course, don't want anything of this here to happen. Now finally, and this is something that we didn't do in the other controller, is that this await here can of course go wrong. So right now we're assuming that this promise here will always resolve, but of course it can get rejected. So we actually talked about that before in the last lecture, where I intentionally put a wrong key here. So in that case, the promise rejects. And this will of course then also have an effect here on this async await, right? So in order to handle that event here as well, let's add another try catch here. And so we actually, all of this we only want to happen in case that everything goes well, right? And so let's just alert like error processing recipe. Okay, because of course we only want to render, for example, this recipe in case that everything goes well with getting the data from the server. Okay, so let's introduce an error here again. So a wrong key, which will then trigger an error. So let's just click on one of these, and of course it says something went wrong, which comes from the first catch, and then again error processing recipe, which comes from the second catch. Okay, so basically the first one comes from this catch block here, and so then this entire promise here will reject, and so we will then also enter this catch block here, which will then trigger this second alert. Of course, let's go back to the way it was before. And the error handling could of course be a bit better. So instead of having these alerts, we should add some messages to the user interface, but that's a bit too much for this simple example. And so I'm not going to go that way. Of course, you can implement that yourself if you feel like it. Okay, so that's it for this recipe controller. Now, since we're at it, let's implement the same thing here in this search controller, because we didn't do it up here. So again, we only want to render the results here in case everything goes right with getting the search results from the server. So try, and let's move up all of these and catch the error. Okay, and something else that we want to do here then is to still clear the loader. Okay, so we don't want to render the results, but we still want the loader to go away in case that there's an error. Okay, so that should be it. Okay, everything's working. And so next up, let's actually continue building our model here, because now we need to process these ingredients. Right now it comes back as an array with just 11 strings, but we want this to be a bit better. And so in the next lecture, we're going to take care of that.